Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. Well, it's been a long year, but finally we are ready to put our cap on 20th Century Boys. At the heart of this story is a coming-of-age tale about two characters, Kenji and his friend. Now, it's virtually impossible to discuss either of these characters without spoilers, so this is going to be one of those videos where everything gets spoiled. If you don't like that, I would recommend reading the story before you watch this. Furthermore, while I intend to start with Friend, I'm not going to be discussing these characters in particular order. They intersect so much, I will probably be flipping back and forth between them quite a bit. Finally, there is one aspect about Friend that I haven't touched on too heavily. I don't have any formal education in the Japanese language. I basically have some translation notes and some things I've picked up through osmosis to base what I'm about to say on. So take this more as the viewpoint of an amateur rather than a professional in the subject of translating the Japanese language. The first thing to discuss about Friend is his Japanese name, which is Tomodachi. And I know I've butchered that pronunciation just like just about every other Japanese word I try and say. The point is, Tomodachi is a word that refers to a specific kind of friendship. Japanese, like most non-English languages, has a bunch of words to describe relationships that are much more nuanced than what we have here in America. Tomodachi is one of those words. It refers specifically to a childhood friend, as opposed to a friend you might have from work or a casual acquaintance that you might see at the store every day or at a hobby shop you frequent. How young do you have to be in order to call a friend you make a childhood friend? That's a little unclear, at least to me. Again, I don't have all the cultural context. Just based on what I've seen, it looks like you have to have met the person in grade schools, somewhere between 1st and 6th grade, in order to call them a tomodachi. If you meet them in middle school or high school, it looks like the term no longer applies. Call the cutoff age roughly 10 years old. This is important for a couple of reasons we'll get to, but the big thing is that there is a special significance placed on tomodachi as opposed to other kinds of friends. Now, my reading as an outsider looking in without a great deal of cultural grounding is that the Japanese, living in a very tightly knit society clustered in close proximity and not given to moving around a great deal, place high value on these early friendships as they are the foundation for the community you will live in for the rest of your life. Now, this was true the world over once upon a time, but it appears to remain more true in Japan than in, say, America or even Europe. As a result, Kenji's arch rival being one of his tomodachi, which all of the main cast are actually, is a significant source of conflict and struggle for Kenji in and of itself. This is someone he is supposed to share a unique bond with, who is now at odds with him. I think this nuance is important to point out, mainly because, for Americans, well, a lot of Americans don't have that kind of close childhood friendship anymore. They don't have friends that they meet when they are 7 or 8 years old who they still know when they are reaching their 50s. I started this series of videos when I was the same age as Kenji is in the story, and I know one person that I still see on a semi-regular basis that I knew when I was 10. And that is a stark contrast to the kind of relationships that Urasawa depicts in 20th Century Boys. It is a difference of time period, and it is a difference of culture. And this element of the relationship is integral to understanding everything that happens between the two characters in the story. After all, Tomodachi is recreating Kenji's childhood games as an express rebuke to Kenji and who he is. The bad blood between them goes back almost 30 years, and that is quite something. That is a very long time to hold on to a grudge, and it says a lot about Tomodachi right off the bat that he resents Kenji this much. It is also a powerful testimony to Kenji and the kinds of bonds he has built with people, the kinds of value he puts on those Tomodachi he has brought forward with him, that every time we see him meet one of his childhood friends and assess whether they can be the Tomodachi or not, we see how heavy that is for him, how difficult it is for him to consider these things. And we also see the pain it puts him in to know that friends like Donkey, and later we know even his older sister, have fallen prey to the vile behavior of this one person. The dynamic between them thus is very, very strong. And while I think that the second act is very good in the way it builds up its characters, I think lacking that particular personal animus is kind of a shortcoming of the second part of the story. Telling so much of the story from Kana's point of view robs it of some impact. Yes, as the audience, we know that Kana is Tomodachi's daughter, but she doesn't know that, and so we don't see the same kind of emotional turmoil from her. We don't get to see her character in that light for very long. Only when it is ultimately revealed to her, about halfway through the second act, do we really see her grapple with those implications, which is a very important part of understanding her character, yes, but we don't get to see as much of it as we do with Kenji. Of Kenji's circle of childhood friends, Maro is the only one we really see grapple with the impact on himself personally of knowing that Tomodachi is someone they knew and cared about. And even then, it seems more tangential to the other emotional and moral questions he is weighing as he visits the FTP headquarters. So really, the strength of Friend's connection to this circle of childhood friends only shows itself when he is in relation to Kenji. That makes him a very powerful and illuminating villain from the point of view of a coming-of-age story, but I think it takes away a little bit of the powerful impact he should have had on the other characters if they truly all knew each other very intimately. Still, I think one of the best interactions between these two characters in the story is when Friend has infiltrated Kenji's inner circle in his identity as Fukube. That gives us a great chance to see Friend manipulating and deceiving people while also sounding out Kenji, and at the same time gives Kenji a great chance to show some of his strongest elements, his ability to interact with people, to take a personal interest in them, to be a supportive member of their community, to really care about the challenges they have, or at least the challenges that Kenji thinks they have. And it makes it very clear that Tomodachi does not want to destroy Kenji because he has a false impression of who Kenji is. He wants to destroy Kenji because he does not care who Kenji is now. He only cares about who Kenji was as a child. This is one of the first indications that Tomodachi is stuck in the past and cannot get out of it, and that Kenji himself must move forward in order to overcome the hurdle Tomodachi represents. It's a very appropriate meeting to be the capstone for the first act, and it is masterfully constructed because it does not entirely make sense until all of the pieces are put in place for us later down the road. Now, because Tomodachi and Kenji are separated for the second act of the story, there's really not a whole lot to discuss about their progression in that part of the story. Kenji is missing and presumed dead, so he's not on screen at all, and Friend is not really serving as a direct antagonist for the most part. He's really an indirect one who looms in the background. The only significant issue here is his quote-unquote death in the science classroom on the eve of 2015. There's a lot of issues with this moment for the story. I've already said that I don't think the reveal that Tomodachi was Katsumata rather than Fukube is a very good one, and I've already discussed at length my reasons for why I think that is, so I'm not going to rehash them here. That said, I do think that you can make a decent argument for this. I just don't think it's a good decision from a storytelling perspective. We have seen Friend fake his death once before. Of course, when he was disguised as Fukube, he made it look like he had fallen off a roof when in fact he had survived. And the human mind likes events to come in threes, so having him fake his death twice before he finally dies at the end of 21st Century Boys does round out the numbers nicely. That said, I do want to go back and look at the flashback sequence where we got all of Tomodachi's backstory. This is where it is really established how Katsumata could have replaced Fukube. He disguised himself as Sadakiyo for much of the summer of 1970, and all three of them, Fukube, Sadakiyo, and Katsumata, were wearing the same mask pretending to be each other to cover for each other's supposed being out of town, in Fukube's case, or being dead, in Katsumata's case. They all got used to being each other and supposedly, in Katsumata's case, never stopped. This is pretty far-fetched, especially because both Fukube and Katsumata supposedly had living parents. I don't know how you get away with that kind of masquerade, but there it is. Again, I've already talked at length about that. What I want to look at is the question of, does this undercut or support the unique relationship that should exist between Tomodachi and Kenji? At first glance, it seems that Fukube is the one who should share that unique relationship with Kenji because he is actually the one who is there for a large chunk of Kenji's childhood. He is the one with the better claim to call himself a Tomodachi vis-a-vis Kenji. They've gone to school together for years, whereas Katsumata seems to have had very little to no direct contact with Kenji outside of the summer of 1970 when he was pretending to be Sadakiyo and Fukube. In fact, Kenji is so out of touch with who Katsumata is, he believes a story about him dying the year before, just like everyone else at the school. However, there is a common trope in Japanese media about very brief childhood encounters making such marked impressions on people that they continue to act upon them all the way into adulthood and even old age. So, even though this may not seem intuitive, there is at least a cultural foundation for this kind of relationship to be based on. I personally do not find it a particularly high hurdle to get over to think that while he was pretending to be someone else, Katsumata came to resent everyone that he saw wearing that mask. And he just carried that grudge forward into adulthood because it was such a powerful formative experience. The third act of the story is the biggest act for both of these characters, as we should expect. It is the biggest act for Kenji because we see how he has changed. Especially for Kenji because we see how he has changed over the 18-year gap where he's been entirely out of the story. Kenji has become a very different person. He is still caring, he still takes care of the people around him, but he is much more willing to demand that they take a hand in solving the problems they face themselves. Kenji used to sweep in to save the day like a hero in a kids' show. Now, he does that on very rare occasions, but he also pushes other people very hard to be the best that they can be, so that they can help him change the world, rather than just watching him fight against the corruption that has taken hold of their society. We also see Kenji come to grip with his art. Kenji is a musician. Once upon a time, he thought he could change the world with his music. By the end of the third act, we see him confront a member of Tomodachi's FDP and tell him point blank, music cannot change anything. After all, the song that Kenji has written and that is currently sweeping across Japan, he wrote before his first confrontation with Tomodachi on Bloody New Year's Eve, and yet nothing came of that at the time. And that was not because of the shortcomings of Kenji's music. After all, everyone who has heard that song apparently loved it. The failure to change the world came from Kenji's own shortcomings. Shortcomings he has had a great deal of time to grapple with. Kenji tried to win the battle on his own. He sent everyone away from him, and he carried the burden himself, and he was not equal to the task. His strength failed. His stratagem failed. His understanding of his enemy failed. And as a result, the world was plunged into far greater darkness than he could have anticipated at the time. When Kenji comes back to settle the feud, he has to face his shortcomings. He has to face his lack of courage, his lack of wisdom, and his lack of ability. It is in his willingness to face his shortcomings that he begins to find what he needs to overcome them, and he begins to pull people into his wake in order to stand strong at that final confrontation. Of course, Kenji had many of the people he needed already, he just wasn't willing to run the risk of losing them in the face of the threat that Tomodachi presented. That's very understandable, but also naive and short-sighted. Tomodachi could have killed any of his friends at any moment in time in the 18 years between Bloody New Year's Eve and their final confrontation. Kenji's weakness ultimately put his friends at more risk than standing strong in the face of the threat would have done. As Kenji grows in his understanding and ability, and in his support from the general populace, we see Friend move in the opposite direction. He seems to be losing touch with reality. He is set on going to Mars, even though we see very clearly that there is no functioning space program in his regime. We see his organization go through a number of very bloody purges that cuts down on the number of people who trust him, and then ultimately he reveals all of his misdeeds on national television, which causes the general populace to turn against him as well. In many ways, these character developments are typical of the fall of an evil regime in Eastern literature. We see a person of virtue gaining the support of the populace and eventually the mandate of heaven, while the corrupt and faltering but still very powerful leader slowly bleeds support and touch with reality. The mirroring of these two character arcs is very interesting, but not particularly groundbreaking. What's fascinating is putting it in the middle of all the relationships that Kenji has with his other Tomodachi, his other adult friends, which I've already discussed in my previous video. Seeing Kenji reunited with his friends puts his personal virtues and ability to attract people in a recognizable context that makes Kenji feel less like he is a conquering hero and more like a prodigal son who has come home and will finally take up his role in his community. Kenji's strained relationship with Kana is a perfect signpost of this. Sure, he's come back and everyone is glad to see him, but there are a number of problems that he still has to sort out. He's not just swooping in to save the day, as he thought he could do when he was a child. Kenji is a grown man now, and he has to take up the responsibilities of a man, rather than the responsibilities of a child or even an adolescent. What's fascinating about Kenji's character arc is that we see him come to age as a hero multiple times in the story. First as a young child, as he plays the games that hone in him the sense of heroism and determination that will carry him forward. Then, as a young adult, as he grapples with his gifts, how best to use them, and what society will make of him if he is a success or a failure. Then, as a full-grown adult, as he has to take responsibility for his family and community in spite of the expense that may levy against him, and ultimately must involve himself in danger not because it is heroic, but because he cares about the people around him and he has a real investment in their lives and well-beings. Finally, we see him come of age as a grown man who is preparing to leave the world to the next generation, embodying his success, his failure, his love and his sorrow, his dreams and his disappointments into a message that they can keep with them, that they will remember and treasure as their lives go on. Ultimately, what Kenji leaves them is a warning and a promise about the way the world is and the way it can be. It is that message that he leaves with the people when he walks off the stage at his first concert. And I think that is what makes his story so great and so powerful. We see him go through every phase of his life and leave the stage on a high note. And that's why ultimately, I think that the proper ending place for Urasawa's story is actually where he leaves it at the end of 20th Century Boys. I think 21st Century Boys is an interesting experiment in trying to answer questions after character arcs are completed, but it also shows the weakness of trying to do that, because I do think that by adding this element of apology between Kenji and Tomodachi, Urasawa creates a dissonant note in a closing chord that perfectly ended the piece he had already composed. And I think while it does make Tomodachi's motives a little more clear, the added mud that it adds to who he is and what exactly he was doing the entire story, on top of the added dissonance it adds to Kenji's story, is really not ideal. I prefer to read his story as it was originally written without the aftermath, because it gives us this perfect character arc of a man coming of age in every stage of his life. It has been a real blast for me to revisit this story and get a better sense of it from a point of view that is a little older and a little wiser and a little better equipped to understand what was going through the mind of Urasawa and his characters as he wrote this story. I hope you've enjoyed going on this recollection with me. I know not many people watch these videos, but they are very meaningful for me to make, and they really have helped me think over a great story, and hopefully a few of you will be inspired to go and read this story yourself, because it is, again, one of the best things I've seen out there. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use them as you see fit, and I'll talk to you